Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
Yo, Dad, what's going on? What's going on?
Nothing much. Finally getting back to work this week. I'm back at my research site after spending a nice 2 weeks relaxing, vacationing.
Like trying to get that brain sharp again.
Right. It's still, in that process, but yeah, it's been a pretty good 2 weeks and just ready to get back to work. How about you?
Yeah, same. I mean, last week, because I had the vacation the week before, so my last week was kind of crazy. Just a lot of stuff going on at work and catching up. And I was kind of still exhausted from the vacation. But this week, this Monday, I'm starting things in stride. Seems like it's going to be a good week, being productive, getting back to the swing of things. But it did take a week for me to recover. So hopefully your week does better than my first week back.
Yeah. When vacations involve traveling, you often need a vacation from that vacation, just days to rest, because it's tiring.
Yeah. Because I think the traveling just tires you out. I think the vacation's fun, but then traveling back and flying and driving and whatever, if you have layovers, all that kind of stuff, that takes a little toll. So you need a couple of days just to do nothing from that. But okay. Other than that, ain't not much been going on. I'm trying to think. And for me, other than just working, sometimes it's just like that. That's all the news you got going on in your life, just working.
Right. Can you believe it's April already?
April, I know. And the weather out here was, this past weekend was 70 on Saturday. So it was nice. Yeah, went out for nice walking stuff, got some fresh air. So
spring wants to come.
Yeah, it's peeping its head out. So hopefully it just comes on. Come on, spring.
When does your semester end?
I want to say May, maybe the first week of May, maybe May 2nd or 3rd or something like that. That's the last day of classes. So,
so you got one good month and maybe some grading after, but.
Yep, probably about 5 or so weeks, and then summertime. Summertime. I guess you're still doing your research up until. Well, how long are you doing your research? You going to do it until the school year ends for them, in June or something? Or
yeah, I'll do it till the school year ends. And there's one major event I want to capture in June. And after that, I'm just going to have to buckle down and figure out, what does my analysis and writing schedule look like?
Okay. Yeah, that shouldn't be too bad. Get yourself on a nice routine once you're done with the research.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Now I'm doing the research.
Tiring.
It is. Be able to just sit down and write. That's the, I won't say it's the easier part, but it's definitely a better routine. All right. So, I guess we got some old Lord news ready to rock for this week.
We got a little bit.
All right. Let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to BHD News, where we give you the most current and eye-opening old Lord news of the week. Join us as we present news that'll make you want to say,
Okay, so this first story is actually very kind of alarming to me, especially given my dietary preferences. So Trump has recently threatened to shut down the Mexico border. And it might not seem like a big deal, but if you love avocados like I do, then this is some really big, oh Lord, news. Because if Trump shuts down the borders, then that's going to stop a lot of goods that are imported to the U.S., from fruits to vegetables. You're talking about limes, avocados, tomatoes. Some of those things are primarily come from Mexico. A lot of alcohol that's imported. So it's just kind of like summertime might look a little bit different for us if Trump actually does follow through with his threat to shut down the Mexico border.
Oh, not the avocados, man.
Not the avocado.
Guacamole.
For the bougie people, your avocado toast.
Yeah, avocado toast.
But, just think about even beyond that, like I said, the tomatoes, other vegetables, alcohol. There are some vegetables that aren't named, but it's kind of like these are things that would impact us. So you think about the shutdown that happened earlier in the year and how it had like a ripple effect for, other Americans, even if you were still getting a paycheck. Well, border closings and some of these other decisions will impact you as well. And even if it doesn't cause like a shortage or they never go away, it could mean higher prices, if there's greater demand, because right now I'm buying avocados for like 45 cents. They could be like $2, which they have been before. So just think about like you might be paying a little bit more for goods this summer or this spring if Trump actually does go through with the border closing.
Hopefully, this guy Trump, man, I just feel like nothing ever goes right or feels better. Like we actually gain from him being in office. It's just like everything is detrimental. It's like we lose money from taxes. Now we're going to lose avocados. This man is playing games. People losing their families. Like it's nothing positive about this guy, man.
Right. I mean, but he's still eating good. You know what I'm saying? His family's still profiting off of all of this. And it's us, the everyday Americans, that are most impacted by his egotistical decisions, because all of this is ego. Because the threat is about if Mexico will not stop people from crossing the border, he's going to close the border.
Oh, my goodness. And it's probably going to make things worse.
Yeah.
This is how a lot of people making money over there. Now all of a sudden they can't make no money. So it's probably going to put people more in desperate situations, and they're probably going to come over again, just like what happened before with the NAFTA trade. This guy. Okay.
Yeah.
All righty.
Okay, so this next story is pretty crazy. So I'm sure you've heard of climate change. Do you believe in it? There are some doubters.
Yeah, I'm a believer.
Okay. Well, recently, climate change has resulted in a lot of like mountains, which have a lot of snow and stuff like that. The snow has been melting. And in one instance, people have recently been discovering hikers who kind of passed away on the mountains. Well, climate change might turn Denali into a literal mountain of what? Dookie.
What?
Yes, because people hike these mountains, and where do they go?
That is true. I know.
As the snow starts to melt, so will the what. And they are expecting like a sludge of bowel movement to just start flowing down the mountain.
That's nasty. Oh man, that is nasty. If you live close there, that's a terrible experience, man.
Oh, that's a terrible experience. You can just imagine how that is going to smell. So like, and that's so we talk about climate change. There are deniers. There are people that don't want to put policies in place, but like, there are real consequences to our decisions.
There are. Yeah, this whole climate change thing. But that's crazy. A mountain full of feces, man, just sliding down to people's backyards.
Yes.
That's why, but yeah, I never think about it before. Like when people do hike up these mountains, there's no bathrooms up there, so that's true. That's really true to think about. Okay. That's interesting.
Okay, this next story is a little bit tragic. So a 19-year-old African-American male by the name of Omarion Banks took a lift home to his new apartment. He was not 100% familiar with, the apartment complex that he had just moved into with his girlfriend. He was actually FaceTiming his girlfriend as he knocked on what he thought was a new apartment door. Well, shortly after knocking on the door, a man named Daryl Bynes grabs a gun and threatens him. The boy runs away, but the guy still shoots him from the balcony. And, the guy, Omarion, was apologizing, like, sorry, I'm at the wrong house. The man said, no, you not, N-word, you at the right house. And he shot 2 more times.
Wow. That's sad, man.
Mm-hmm.
These people.
So the man was arrested. I don't know if he's going to try to pull some stand your ground. I don't even know if Georgia has stand your ground. But in case people are wondering, the man that has been arrested appears to be African American to me, or Black, or some variation of it.
That's even why. Why you gotta take somebody's life, man? And especially if they run in and there's an accident. Like, what's wrong with people, man?
Yeah, I don't know. It gave me, it reminded me of that Dallas shooting, but it also kind of reminded me of, like, the Trayvon Martin. It's kind of like, you can make a mistake. You're, in the wrong place, or, and people just like really overreacting. And I think the guy was arrested because Omarion was retreating. He was running away. He was apologizing. And in addition to his girlfriend who was on FaceTime with him, there were other witnesses that heard him saying, sorry, I was at the wrong door.
So sad, man. This stuff with guns and making people feel like they the man or the woman, just taking lives. It's such a bad thing. It's such a sad thing. And and rest in peace too. Like this whole Nipsey Hussle situation.
Oh yeah.
So sad too. I mean, that's been all Nipsey. Like, oh man, this is like, I guess this isn't. This is one of the times, like, I guess when it comes to artists that really just hit me, because Nipsey, he's like our age, and he coming off a great year with his album, and Grammy nominated, and had a lot of things in the works. It's funny seeing that all these other artists, who are saying rest in peace to Nipsey, the Drakes and the J. Coles and everybody talking about how they all had songs lined up to come out this summer with him. Like he was about to pop this next coming year. And not only just his career wise, but just following Nipsey's, following his his life and the things that he were doing. Like he was really promoting Black businesses and being self-sustaining and investing and getting assets and growing in our communities a lot, so it's like he was just such a positive thing for our culture, for not just the music industry, but for all of us, for the Black community in general. And, to see this happen to him over something that I'm pretty sure was silly. An argument or what have you, to somebody take his life with gun violence is like super sad.
They said that he actually tweeted like 1 or 2 hours before, like that having like the, strong enemies is the greatest or something like that. I wonder if he was feeling, that sense that people were
out to get him. Yeah, I think it was something like that, like having the strongest enemies, the greatest film. There's something along those lines.
Yeah.
And so, and it's shortly after, outside of one of his businesses, or I think it was a clothing store or something like that. He got shot, and it's just sad because, him and Lauren London, tight, of course, been together for a while, and leaving behind 2 kids. He's a father. It's just super sad, man. Nothing's worth it. So I know everybody's mourning about that. Just to see a good person go, 33 years old.
Yeah.
And his album is great.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And his album is very positive, talking about, motivating and building up our own communities and things from his life and his narrative. That's a tough one. So rest in peace, Nipsey, and sending positive energy and prayers to his family and his kids and all that stuff.
I agree.
Another thing I want to talk about too is this whole Cardi B situation. You heard about that?
Oh, when they were like
With her.
surviving Cardi B.
Yeah, and I was curious though because that was interesting to me. I really never think about it before, but listening to the debate about Cardi B. So for those of you who don't know, Cardi B, an old video of her surfaced when she was kind of talking about how she had to grind and how she was hustling back in her stripper days. And one of the things that she used to do was essentially take men would she would kind of offer up sex and men would go back with her and she would pay them for sex and she would drug their drinks and pretty much, they would either pass out or what have you. She would drug them and then she would rob them and then leave. And then, so now there's a lot of controversy about this because, in the whole Me Too era, we've seen, people like Bill Cosby and others who, if people are saying when a man does this, it's the blowback is very big and problematic and people, take it seriously. And so people are saying, should we take this Cardi B situation just as serious? Should she be canceled? It's kind of rape culture or drugging people and robbing them, the whole situation. And so it's an interesting conversation to be had about. So I was kind of wondering your thoughts from what you heard about it or what you think about it.
I feel like people are right to call her to the carpet. Should she be canceled? I'm not going to get into that, but I don't think anybody should ever be too big that they cannot be called out for what they've done that's wrong. And I feel like I've seen debates on both sides, like, guys, because there was Rick Ross where he talked about putting a Molly in somebody's drink. But if I remember, he got called out on that too. And so
he lost a lot of sponsorships.
Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where I think people love Cardi B. So, because at least along my timeline, it was all kind of defending her. And for me, it's one of those things where I don't want to like somebody so much that I cannot call them out when they are wrong. And I don't, because it reminds me of too much of the Trump things, I can shoot somebody in the middle of Times Square and I'm gonna be fine. I don't care who you are. I don't want anybody to have that type of effect on humans to where they can do anything and people are gonna find a way to defend it. So I'm gonna say that is kind of where my sentiments about this come from. I think it's wrong, drugging people, robbing people. There are a lot of people that are in dire situations and they turn to crime to, address their issues of poverty. And I think that's an issue that deserves to be talked about. Sometimes people are pushed into these situations. And I think you can hold that and say, we kind of understand how she might have been pushed into certain lifestyles because of her circumstances. And also say she was wrong, especially the drug, people could have died from being drugged. And so I think that reminds us of our conversation, I think back in December, about how people can both be victims and perpetrators. She's a victim of her circumstance of poverty, but she's also a perpetrator by drugging and robbing people, and not very smart at all for advertising it. She caught herself up by feeling the need to brag about it on social media and actually make tapes of that. That just also wasn't smart. But I don't want anybody to ever get too big where they can't be called out. So I don't want to hear too many excuses I understand. No, she was wrong.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely what it boils down to, right? Just the nuts and bolts of the situation. The behavior was wrong. You're drugging people, you're robbing them. I mean, there's nothing right about that. I agree with you too. This shouldn't be something that should be glorified. This is something that shouldn't be glorified from Cardi B or her fans. But and also what I've been finding interesting too is because a lot of men have been no, it's not that serious. It comes with the territory, with sex work or people who are prostitutes or whatever. It happens. People get robbed. That's always a risk. And also, so it's men have been kind of brushing it aside as well and not trying to take it as serious. But then I've also heard conversations of why it's not being taken serious. And people are when it's female victims, oftentimes female victims come forward and then, it makes things a little different. But they were the way, masculinity is set up and things like that, it's going to be rare for men who are victims like this to come forward, right? Because they'll, whatever, be seen as less of a man, or you got God and things like that. So it's like, even when these situations happen and the woman is the perpetrator, will male victims come out and say, raise their hands and be like, I was a victim and let's take this serious. So it just sparked a lot of interesting conversation, things that I really didn't think about when it's flipped on the other side, when we talk about Me Too and what's been going on, this kind of culture and stuff like that.
I do have a question. So in rap, a lot of illegal behaviors are generally kind of glorified. So it's just kind of like people in rap songs, they talk about robbing people. Is there a difference between taping a YouTube or Snapchat or whatever video talking about how you used to drug and rob people versus like talking about robbing people or whatever in a rap song? Is there a difference?
There's really no difference, right? I mean, a crime is a crime. So yeah, you're talking about robbing and shooting and stabbing and killing and doing jail time. And that's the funny thing about it. What I also think about this is that people don't realize, like, the crime world is gendered in a lot of ways too. And so female crimes and male crimes are different. So yeah, a lot of the male crimes are gonna be drug dealing and the violence or what have you. But what Cardi did is very common. Like if a female perpetrator is going to be things dealing with sex work and getting over on people, right? Or robbing them in that fashion. So it's like she committed crimes that are gendered in a way, right? So now that she's where she is and she's telling her life story, her narrative is essentially the same as any other rapper or whoever that's talking about their life story. And if they were doing drug dealings and stuff like that, it's just a different type of crime. So I don't think one is worse than the other per se. If it's accepted and we accept it where all these other male rappers say it, then it should be somewhat accepted if Cardi was putting it in songs too. As well. So it's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to say the least.
I don't know. I'm trying to figure out whether I think the response would have been different if she had rapped it, because sometimes I'm going to be honest and say, I don't 100% believe everything that rappers say that they did, especially when they're doing it in rap. But it was just kind of like, I really believe that she did those things because it was kind of like her own confessional.
Yeah, she said it on Instagram.
So I think that was the difference for me. It's kind of like, oh yeah, you a killer, you a drug dealer. Probably ain't never even seen her. Because to be honest, like what was his name, Lil Yachty, or the one with the red hair? Like, you look at these rappers' backgrounds, like, oh yeah, you grew up in a 2-parent household in the suburbs, and now you like this mumble rapper or whatever you. So it's just kind of like, there are a lot of like rappers who I'm just like, I don't believe you when you rap about these things, although you are glorifying them, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense. So I think, yeah, if she put it in the song, it probably definitely be received a little different. But then again, even that begs conversation too, because it's like when Rick Ross said it, he lost mad sponsorships. And so it's like, if Cardi said it in the song, would she lose mad sponsorships? Who knows? But Rick Ross was never as big as Cardi B.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people were just saying too, just like, is Cardi B going to be affected by this? Probably not. But they said if victims came forward, then probably she would start losing things. So I think that'll probably be the truth too. I really don't think she's going to lose any money from it right now, because she makes a lot of people a lot of money at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, Cardi, she, the spotlight is on her right now. And yeah, it's going to be hard to, and I don't want her to be taken down, but it'll be hard to take her down. I just want to make sure that there's nobody in this world that's too big to be called out or punished if they do something wrong. I just don't like that. It's just something that's scary about that. So.
And one last thing I want to talk about too, that because I feel like a lot has happened. We saw that Omari Hardwick and Beyonce situation.
Oh my God, yeah, B2. They call that B2.
I was like, what is Ghost doing in these streets, man? Out here causing them up. Again, for those of you who don't know, it was the NAACP Awards and Image Awards this past weekend, and Beyonce and Jay-Z were recognized. And, you know, a lot of other black celebrities there. And there was this clip going around of Amari Hardwick, who plays Ghost in the show Power. And he was, you know, greeting and saying hello to Jay-Z and then Beyonce. And essentially what he did was he said hello to Jay-Z, and he went over to Beyonce and like gave her a hug. But first he gave her like a kiss on the cheek, then he gave her a hug, and it was like a long embrace. And then he gave her like another kiss on the cheek as he was leaving, but it really wasn't on the cheek. It was very close to her lips.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of controversy. Everybody saying, come on, bro, you're doing the most. And like, what is he doing? And all this blowback and all the beehive, leaving bee emojis all in his comments and all that stuff. So it was just pretty funny.
It's funny. Okay, the first kiss, so I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a hugger. You know what I'm saying? Like some people are more touchy-feely. I felt like the first kiss was, okay, cool. That second one, it's like you're doing a whole lot. Yeah. You did a whole lot. And the expression on her face, I felt like she was trying to hide it, but I think that bothered her too. Like, if you saw her, I don't know. Yeah. It looked like she was trying not to react, but I saw a reaction. Like, it was like a what the, you know what? Like, TF.
I saw it in her face too, you know, and I was looking hard. I was like, maybe I'm just seeing it, but like, because the first kiss on cheek was normal. Yeah. It was like definitely on the cheek, quick hug. But that second one was mad close to the lips. I'm sure he got a little bit of lip. Yeah. And she probably was like, what the hell? Yeah. You know, in front of all these people, everybody saying hello. Jay's right there. And I'm sure if you would have said something to Jay, might not have went so well. So she played it cool, but you know, Omari he about to get it. I know he married and stuff like that, so I'm even wondering what his wife thinking. Like, bro, what you over there doing, man?
Well, you know what? If we're gonna talk about him, we cannot dismiss talking about the Biden controversy.
Oh my goodness, yes. You want to tell the people about that?
Yes. So recently, I think Arizona, either lawmakers, I think she had run for lieutenant governor. I'm not going to pretend to remember the title. But Biden had campaigned on her behalf. Prior to going out on stage, Biden put his hands on her shoulders, or she says, allegedly, you know, put his hands on her shoulder, kind of put his nose in the back of her hair, and I think also gave her like a kiss in the back of the head before she went out, and she didn't like it. And this was also followed by the fact that there are lots of like little clips and videos of Biden doing this to lots of other women at like large events, the hands on the shoulder, the kind of nose in the hair. And I've seen that before. Like if you just Google like, you know, Biden touching or something like that, you'll probably come across a lot of memes where like, I think before the Me Too movement, it was kind of a joke of like, you know, Biden kind of like creepy a little bit. But I think now in the Me Too era, people are like, this is really inappropriate. Because I remember people, at least in my online message board community, like people joking about Biden, like doing things like that. But now that like Me Too and we're like really discussing like what is appropriate and what's not, all of these incidents are like, Biden, I don't know about you.
Yeah. It's a bit wild. You know, he's being accused of these things. And I think, it's funny how like time changes things, because a few years ago, we looked at it like, oh, you know, everybody's either joking about it, it's not that serious, or like, come on, bro, what are you doing? But now when people address these things or it comes up, it's a different lens, and it's not taken so kindly. And so he had to come out. I think he did come out and like issue a statement pretty much saying that like, you know, he was probably wrong, and you know, you need to take, when women come out and say these things, you know, take it seriously and really consider and be careful of your actions. So you know, his response was good, but it's like, if you've done it, I didn't know I just knew it was the one woman that has come out in Dubai. I know this was like a behavior of his. That's something he always did, which is now raises my eyebrows a little bit more like, okay, bro, what are you doing?
Yeah, and like I said, you can find videos, and I just Googled because, that was, I don't want to be dismissive of Lucy Flores's position. It was the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor of Nevada, not Arizona. So I had the title correct, not the state, and her name is Lucy Flores.
Okay.
But yeah, it's crazy, and it doesn't look very good, especially when you put it within the context of him. I think going so hard at the Anita Hill. What do you call that? Like the investigation of like the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas incident that she spoke about. And, people have been calling him to task on that recently because they were like, you went really hard on her. You hadn't like apologized to her in the way that you should have, especially when we think about like the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation and how the professor stepped forward to talk about that. And, when Professor Anita Hill went up in the early 90s, that was a very different time. It wasn't the era of Me Too, and the way she was treated was like considered appalling, and Joe Biden was a part of that. And I think people really started like looking at him sideways when the Brett Kavanaugh investigation and confirmation came up, because it's kind of like, we're at this place again, and now we have a very different tone to, how we're investigating these allegations. So I think his touchy-feeliness looks 10 times worse when you put it within the context of, I think, the way he handled the Anita Hill investigations.
For sure. And, I've also, you hear about him and Stacey Abrams?
Yeah.
That rumor. Yeah, Stacey, apparently, they were saying that Joe Biden was looking to have Stacey Abrams run as his running partner. And she was like, nah, pretty much like, you didn't endorse me when I was running and didn't really hear from you. And now, I'm not going to help you look good or, make your platform better. It's just not going to happen. So I thought that was admirable of Stacey Abrams. I feel like some people were taking a run like, oh, this is an opportunity. I could be vice president. But she has some principles that she stands on. Is like, the way you treat me, don't think you're going to come in now and I'm going to come save you in a lot of ways.
Because they are always looking for Black women to save them after the fact, And I feel like it's good that she did. Because she could have really bolstered him up. She really could have.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what he needed. But nah, player, you got to do better than this. And so I think this also kind of leads us into our topic today, where we talk about white fragility with author Robin DiAngelo. You guys may have heard of this book. It came out not too long ago, and I've seen it, on tons of headlines and social media and people rapping about it. It's a New York Times bestseller. So it's awesome having this opportunity to come speak with such an amazing author about this work, really talking about white folks and racism, and pretty much how it understands racism is a practice, and it's not only restricted to like the bad people, right? Quote unquote bad people, essentially people who we always know are like explicitly racist and hate Black folks. But she really highlights how people like white allies and white liberals also participate in racism in a lot of ways, and how it's a defense mechanism. These defensive moves actually help racism continue. So it's a really, really interesting book, and an even better conversation that we had with her today.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect conversation to have around this time. And the book is awesome. You should pick it up.
Yeah, definitely pick it up. But this is an awesome interview, so we're not gonna hold y'all up anymore. We're gonna get to it, and then we'll catch up with y'all after the interview. All right.
Discussions about race and racism in America are often led by African Americans and other people of color. Generally missing from these conversations are white Americans who have been insulated from racial discomfort, largely due to our segregated society. Today, we interview Dr. Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, and explore the implications of white fragility on our nation's discourse about race and the experiences of everyday racism among people of color. Additionally, we discuss the role of progressives in contributing to racist systems of oppression and how the white community can move forward in addressing issues of race and racism. Welcome, Dr. DiAngelo.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, we're very happy to have you.
Yes. So the way we like to start our interviews with our guests is just for our guests to tell our listeners a little bit about themselves. So can you give us a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to do what you're doing today?
Yeah, well, I'm a white woman. I live in Seattle, Washington. I grew up poor and working class, so I didn't go to college till much later in life. And there I was, graduated with a degree in sociology and had no idea what I could do for a living. And then I saw this job for a diversity trainer, and I just thought, oh, wow, that just sounds so cool. And of course, I'm qualified to lead people in discussions of racial inequality. After all, I'm a vegetarian, so I couldn't possibly be racist. I'm facetiously making a point, several points. One, white progressive obliviousness. Two is the mediocrity with which white people get away with. I mean, I was not qualified for the job. I thought it would be fun. And I got it. And I was really in for the most profound learning of my life. And it was a parallel process. Kind of part one was working side by side with people of color who were challenging the way I saw the world and my place in it. And part of being white is I could be that far in life and never have experienced my racial worldview challenged before, and never in any kind of sustained way by a significant number of people of color. And I was like a fish being taken out of water. I wouldn't have even been able to tell you I had a racial worldview, right? I was just human, right? I was just an individual. And then we went out into the workplace in interracial teams to try to talk to almost, overwhelmingly white employees, sometimes 100% white, about, racial inequality and the hostility and the delusional outrage about reverse discrimination. And I had enough of my own socialization to relate to it, but I was getting a very, very transformed worldview. And at first I was pretty immobilized by it. But over time, I just got better and better at articulating how we white people pull off an insistence that our race has no meaning in a society that is profoundly separate and unequal by race. So after years of that, I went on to get my PhD in the field called whiteness studies, which might sound kind of awkward to your listeners. But for as long as white people have studied race, we've tended to study you, not ourselves. And as long as we've been doing that, people of color have been saying, why don't you study yourselves? You are our problem, after all. And in the late 80s, early 90s, some scholars took up that call. And so whiteness studies is really the examination of whiteness, of white supremacy, white racial identity, etc.
That's really interesting, and I'm happy you brought up the point about whiteness studies. It's a growing field, and I think is like you said, like other people have said, I think is much needed just to kind of understand, different worldviews. So I'm happy you're really doing this work.
Thank you.
So the title of your book, White Fragility, Why Is It So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism? And we're going to talk about the content of your book. But before we do that, can you just tell our listeners what it means when you say white fragility and what that looks like?
Yeah, the fragility term is meant to capture how little it takes to unsettle and upset white people on issues of race. So for many white people, the mere suggestion that being white has meaning will cause great umbrage. To generalize about white people will definitely cause umbrage, right? White people do not like being generalized about. Part of being white is the privilege of being seen and seeing oneself as an individual separate from one social group. We've really never had to build our capacity to withstand the discomfort of being challenged racially, right? But the impact of our fragile response and our fragile sensibilities is not light at all. The impact is not fragile. The impact is powerful because it's a weaponized kind of defensiveness and hurt feelings and tears. And it functions really effectively to maintain the racist status quo and our dominance. I think of white fragility as the sociology of dominance. Kind of the everyday ways that the average white person protects white supremacy and how they benefit from it.
It's interesting because even, the term white fragility, and even when we talk about racism and racist, right? I think the first image that comes to mind are, of course, maybe post before the civil rights and extreme racist and Ku Klux Klan and that extreme kind of explicit form of racism. But in your book, you mentioned that, and I think you state that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color when we talk about these issues of race and racism and having this conversation. So what led you to draw that conclusion? Because I know that probably had people do a double take and also raise some eyebrows, because when we think of white progressive, we think of allies to the movement and to people of color, but you are saying otherwise. So kind of, can you explain your conclusion in that regard?
Absolutely. Just before I do, I want to just add a piece about what I had said earlier about the umbrage white people take at being generalized about. And I want to be really clear. Yes, I am an individual. I am also a member of a social group in which you can literally predict whether my mother and I were going to survive my birth based on my race. And you can predict how long I'm going to live based on my race. It is profound and it has meaning. And yes, we're individuals, but we also have to be willing to grapple with the collective socialization that we all receive by virtue of living in a shared culture and swimming in shared water. The reason that I like to kind of, let me put it this way, white progressives are my specialty. And that is because I'm a huge white progressive and I understand the consciousness. And earlier when I, facetiously said that I thought my vegetarianism, qualified me as free of racism, I was being facetious, but not completely, right? We tend to be incredibly sure that it's not us, right? So first of all, white progressives are most likely to be in the lives of people of color, but we see ourselves as free of racism. And so we're not receptive at all to receiving feedback on our inevitable, but often unaware racist patterns. We can be incredibly arrogant, incredibly certain, and really lack humility. I think white progressives can be the hardest to try to talk to about what we're saying and doing that is not actually conveying what we think it conveys, right? We tend to put all our energy into making sure you see us as free of racism. Of course, none of the things we think are doing that is probably convincing to you, but we don't know that, right? So all our energy goes into kind of self-image, and none of it goes where it needs to go for the rest of our lives, which is ongoing, continual education, mistake-making, risk-taking, humility, vulnerability, and ultimately strategic, intentional anti-racist action. White progressives seem to think that niceness is enough. Right? Just smile at, people of color when you walk past them, and that shows that you're free of racism. So that leads to another point you raised, which is what we think a racist is. Yes, there are avowed, what I think of as card-carrying racists. They march in Charlottesville. I think our president is quite proud of his racism. Like everybody else, he will deny he has it, but he uses it quite effectively and strategically. I am not an avowed racist in that really the only difference I see between Donald Trump and myself, because I recognize what comes out of his mouth. It's not like I haven't heard it. It's not like it also hasn't been planted in my head. But I'm really, really working to challenge it where I see him as embracing it, right? But this idea that racists are always individuals, which of course obscures the system of racism. A racist must be aware that they're racist, which then, of course, denies the power of implicit bias, and they must intentionally seek to be mean to somebody based on race. So individual, conscious malintent across race. And that definition exempts virtually all white people from the very system we're in, and that we, are invested in, quite frankly. So if that's my definition of a racist, and you just suggest something I've said or done is racist, no matter how diplomatically you try to say it, what I'm going to hear is, you just said I was an immoral person. You just said I was a deliberately mean person. And now I'm going to have to defend my moral character. It just so beautifully sets us up to refuse to engage. And to be defensive. And that in turn polices you into not going there with us, lest you risk more punishment.
So, in thinking about the pushback you probably receive in engaging with white people about these ideas. So for our listeners, again, you've been, been a consultant and a trainer for over 20 years on issues of race, racial and social justice. And, you've just talked about some of the challenges that some people face when, you kind of confront them with maybe their ideologies or even their behaviors. And so I'm interested in listening or hearing more about the challenges you face in talking about racism with white people. And, also how do you overcome those barriers?
The first challenge it came to my mind when you thanked me for doing this work, and I appreciate that. And there is a dilemma in me as a white person doing this work, right? Most people, if you ask them, how often have you had a teacher of the same race as yourself, and how often from a different race? Most white people overwhelmingly will say pretty much always I've had a teacher of my own race. And people of color, pretty much the answer is seldom and sometimes never, right? So over and over, the archetype of the holder of knowledge, right? The authority, the disciplinarian is a white person. And so here I stand in front of people every day, yet again, right? Like every other pretty much leader or authority, as certified by dominant culture, as an expert on race, no less, right? So as I stand there, I know that I am reinforcing whiteness, right? I am reinforcing all of that for everyone who's listening to me, whether they're conscious of it or not. At the same time, based on the power of implicit bias, white people are more likely to be open to hearing it from me than they would be from a person of color. So you've got this kind of, as Audre Lorde calls the master's tools dilemma. On the one hand, I am centering whiteness. On the other hand, I'm using my position to challenge it, right? Because in a tricky sleight of hand, whiteness stays centered by being unmarked and unnamed, right? It's the backdrop that's never identified. You have race. I don't have race. You're a special, particular kind of human. I am a universal, unmarked human, right? I mean, I could go on about how whiteness remains unmarked. So to decenter it, you have to expose it, right? So it's a both and constantly that I'm navigating. But for me to not use my position in that way is to really be white, right? And I'm just not going to be silent and maintain white solidarity on it, even though part of the price is the reinforcement of it. So that's one dilemma, right? And it's certainly one that people of color notice and sometimes understandably feel some resentment for, right? There's not much I'm saying that hasn't been said for centuries by people of color. And so much of what I'm able to articulate about what it means to be white rests on the brilliant mentorship and work of people of color. You know, as an insider to whiteness, I do have an understanding that you can't have. But I think people of color understand what it means to be white to a degree that I never will. So you've got all those tensions. And while white people are a little more open to hearing it from me, you know, we're not that open. So pushback, of course, is taking umbrage about, being generalized about, finding, you know, one thing to dismiss the whole presentation on, right? You didn't tell me the answer. You didn't tell me what to do. You didn't identify your gender pronouns, so now I don't have to listen to you. I mean, the left can be as vicious as the right, quite frankly, in really different ways. So it's incredibly difficult to get the arguably most complex, nuanced, and sensitive topic in society, to get that right by everybody, right? I mean, there's no way I can get this right by everybody. I just try to get it as right as I can, as often as I can, by as many as I can. And I can't trust myself to determine that, right? I have to be accountable, in particular to people of color. White people's feedback at this point doesn't carry much weight for me, because I think most white people are not actually informed enough to be able to give good feedback. And if a white person is upset by my talk, honestly, I probably gave a really good talk.
That's funny. And I think, even going along those lines, in one of the articles you wrote, and I saw in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy about white fragility, and you talk about triggers, and even in your book too, racial triggers. And, you state that, these triggers usually cause whites to make defensive moves that include, an outward display of emotions like anger, fear, and guilt. And one of the reasons I was definitely interested and excited for this interview and this conversation too is because even on our podcast, we kind of have this segment called Oh Lord News. And in the beginning, we always talk about outrageous news stories, but a lot of them, for most of the time, always has a story that's been viral, especially with how you kind of talked about earlier, how, race and stuff like this can be weaponized in a lot of ways. And we see a lot of the stories, the viral stories we've been highlighting, have been dealing with the weaponizing the police, calling the police for minor, not even really any infractions at all, from the barbecues to little girls selling water to babysitting, using coupons, mowing lawns, and the list just continues to go on and on. So can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing and maybe why we're seeing this happening so much now, as far as even like the police being called on Black folk for these issues and maybe tying it to white fragility?
Sure. I'm not sure that we're seeing more. I think we now have the means to document what you've been saying for a very long time and what we have not believed, right? That doesn't happen to me. I can't even conceive of worrying about sitting in a Starbucks without ordering anything and being asked to leave, much less have the police called. So when you tell me that happens to you, I just say, well, I'm not sure that's what that was about, right? But now we can record it. Now you have proof this happens to us, and it's always happened to us. So whether it's increasing is hard to say. I just think, again, there's a means to document and prove it. It may also be, if it is increasing, it may be this kind of fear of annihilation, if you will, right? Fear of losing place. The more equality there is, the more white people feel threatened, right? Because equality means that we don't have a dominant position over other people. I think there's also a kind of what white people are responding to is, I'm going to use an old-fashioned term, uppityness, right? It's like you are not in your place. This is my place, and your place is somewhere else, but it's not here. One. And two, when you're in my place, you will defer to me. Right? It's that kind of Jim Crow, you step off the curb when I come down it. This is not necessarily conscious, but no white person grows up in this society, regardless of your age, and and doesn't internalize a message of white superiority. It's relentless. I mean, everybody internalizes it. The research shows that by age 3 to 4, all children of all races who grow up here understand by 3 to 4 that it's better to be white. You know, the message isn't lost on children from a very early age. Now, the impact that message has on me, because I am white, is going to be different than it has on you, but we all get it. And so you've got all this internalized superiority that, of course, can never be admitted to, because that would mean I was a bad person. You probably have some guilt. You have some anxiety. You have some definitely lack of skill or capacity to withstand the tension and the discomfort. You have a group of people who have come to feel entitled to be racially comfortable, so perceive racial discomfort as some kind of breach in the social contract. When you put all that together, it makes us pretty irrational. And I'm going to bet that the two of you have noticed that white people can be really irrational on this topic. And so I think all of that is kind of what you're seeing in this reporting people for breathing, quite frankly. Go ahead and breathe. Just don't breathe in my case. Yeah. I think, I would add something. I think the kind of police state of terrorism, the white collective has needed that in order to have superior schools and neighborhoods, right? I actually don't think middle class and upper class white people, I think they're invested in not having schools be equal, right? And we want our equity and our home value going up. And in order to do that, somebody's has to be down. And as long as you were kept over there in a police state, and I didn't know what happened to you or how it worked, as long as I got the outcome, I was fine with it. I think it's a little harder now to not face it because now it can be visually shown. It happened during the civil rights movement, right? The white collective was shocked when they saw, people being fire hosed and beaten at lunch counters. I mean, it was going on all along, but as long as we didn't know about it, it was okay. And so there was this incredible cognitive dissonance between what we profess to value, our morality, and what is actually taking place in order to protect our interests. And so you get those tensions too. Does that make sense?
It does. And it actually leads me to the next question about the factors that contribute to white fragility, because I know in the article from the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy, you talked about white isolation. And so that kind of leads to your last point. Like, if we can isolate ourselves, if we can kind of not see the problem, conveniently not see the problem, then, it kind of leads to this outcome. So I was wondering if you could actually talk about some of the other factors, particularly your point on universalism and individualism. Just wanted to know, how do both of these discourses contribute to white fragility?
Yeah. First of all, they're different, right? And yet white people we will use them interchangeably. And I think about it as it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to work. And to work, it needs to get racism off the table. So, we're in a meeting at work, a school board, a city council meeting, and we're making decisions that will impact the lives of people who aren't at those tables, and who the people who are at the tables have never been taught to see as valuable, never been taught to consider, live in isolation from, right? And racism comes up, and it's amazing how quick white folks get it off the table, right? So individualism and universalism, even though they're kind of contrary to one another, they'll get invoked in the same conversation because the goal is simply to get racism off the table, which of course protects the racist hierarchy and the white position within it. So individualism is an ideology that each person is special and unique, that there's some kind of intact, stationary, stable, unified person inside here. You get that go find yourself, as if there's some self to find. when in fact I'm different selves in different contexts, right? And so since I'm unique, that allows me a couple of things. One, that discourse allows me to exempt myself from the forces of socialization, to claim that I've been completely untouched by them, and that just because I want to be free of bias, I am. And it also allows me to protect myself from any kind of challenge in terms of, I see this the narrative of the discourse of personal experience also playing out this way, right? So you challenge me, right? I tell you I was taught to treat everyone the same, and you challenge that. And I come back with, well, that's just my personal experience. And as soon as I invoke that, well, then there's nothing you can do because you can't know my personal experience according to this discourse, right? My personal experience is within myself and only I can know it. Right. Again, according to the ideology, I would say there is no personal experience in that way, that all experience is socio-political, that I can only make meaning of what I'm perceiving through the, socio-political framework I've been conditioned to make meaning through. But that narrative allows me to pull all that off, exempt myself, and then protect myself from challenge. And I know you guys are at SUNY New Paltz, so I know I can speak about these kind of post-structuralist terms. I have to do that a little more accessibly when I'm in front of a mainstream audience, but I'm assuming you're tracking me on that. Okay, and then universalism is that kind of, in a really simplistic way, individualism says, why can't we all be individuals? In other words, why can't we all be different? Why do we have to proceed as if race had any meaning, right? My race has no meaning. I'm unique and special. And universalism says, why can't we proceed as if race has no meaning? Not because we're all different, but because we're all the same. Because we all bleed red. We're all red under the skin. We're all God's creatures. We're all human. On and on and on, right? And so there is no specific experience that can be engaged with in any meaningful way, right? So your race has no meaning. My race has no meaning. Now, the presumed human experience, of course, is the white experience, right? In reality, I have been taught to see you as having a specific perspective, and I just have a universal human one. This is why Robert Altman makes films that are universally accessible to everybody, Steven Spielberg, and then Spike Lee makes Black films. And while, Hemingway and, Shakespeare and Louisa May Alcott write books that are universal, but Toni Morrison writes, about the Black experience. There's no white experience. The white experience really human experiences stand in for white experience. Richard Dyer, who's a film critic, talks about that as the God trick, that white people kind of just proclaim reality from some disembodied position, right? Like white men don't speak as white men, they speak as humans. Anyway, so that's kind of how universalism functions and what it grants to white people. Neither of those are really, really authentically applied to people who are not white.
Yeah, and that's interesting because even like looking at some of your work, and one of the things I think that you said you've noticed during your experience of giving talks and consulting and stuff like that is kind of your experience, something known as what you call the rules of engagement, which you said is rooted in white fragility and kind of the experience of how white people should feel as far as getting feedback on things of having conversations centered around race or racism, and how predominantly these feelings come about within them of things that they should be said, like not giving feedback on the racism under any circumstances or talking about it privately or giving it back immediately. These kind of set standards to make white people feel more comfortable when having these conversations. So could you just talk a little bit more about this rules of engagement you found and how you overcome these or bring this out when you have your workshops and discussions?
Sure. And again, I imagine you've come across these unspoken rules of engagement that apparently you should know. It came about in a few different ways. One is just how often people will gather to be educated on racism, but the moment you actually try to help them see how their own racism is manifesting, then, white fragility erupts. You can never suggest that it's actually that person who's participating. We're back to the good, bad binary. I mean, that functions so powerfully and so effectively, and yet it's so simple. It's brilliant, right, in that way. And that article actually came out of a experience where I was the director of equity, a co-director of equity for a large nonprofit, and there was a meeting, and I met with the white group afterwards. It was a very progressive organization. We had racial affinity groups, and I met with the white racial affinity group, and I didn't very delicately say the following. I said, "Oh my goodness, you and you." I pointed to, I named them. I'm not going to use their names. Your whiteness was really showing in that meeting. And I was about to tell them what I had noticed. But I didn't get that far. All hell broke loose 3 hours later, and just tears and tears and tears of every, you did it wrong, right? And every rule that I list there basically came out in that 3 hour a session that had to come following the fact that I had named their whiteness and not done it correctly. Although, I'm being facetious again, but I think the cardinal rule really is there really is no right way to give white people feedback on racism. We don't want feedback on racism. And because I'm in this work, I'd be working with a lot of organizations, and there was always all this talk about having to build trust. We have to make sure there's trust. We have to create a safe space, before we can have these discussions. And I spent some time asking every white person I could, tell me what it is you need to trust will or won't happen, right? What is it? And really, they couldn't really tell me other than, and I'm going to put this in my own words, but it always seemed to come down to was, I need to trust that you won't think I'm racist before I can engage in a dialogue about racism. And, I just say, well, let's let go of that. I think you're racist. I mean, let's just start there. I'm racist, right? I think all white people are socialized into a racist worldview, patterns, investments, assumptions, frameworks. I mean, it's the water we're swimming in. So let's just start from that premise. You won't fool me, and it's actually incredibly liberating and transformative to start from that premise. I can't tell you how liberating it is to just start from the premise that, of course, you've been thoroughly conditioned as a white person into a racist worldview, racist patterns, racist investments, and investments also in not seeing any of those things. And so once you just accept that, you can stop defending, deflecting, denying, hoping you won't notice, explaining, and just get to work trying to figure out, well, what does that socialization look like in my life? How is it coming out in my relationships, in my work? That's actually exciting. But the current paradigm just doesn't allow for that. The current paradigm can only reject any suggestion that a white person could be involved in racism.
That's really insightful. So in thinking about everything you just talked about, how do we move forward from here? Like, in other words, what are some of the practical applications of your work? And what suggestions do you have that you would give to universities to address white fragility?
Yeah, I mean, it's the first thing I want to use an analogy. It's a lot like water dripping on a rock. That's how it's been for me. It's taken years. I mean, I didn't understand it the first time I heard it, the second time I heard it. And even now I slip back. I think the last chapter I share a recent example of my own perpetration of racism towards a coworker. I'm very confident as a result of this work that I perpetrate less racism, which means I do less harm. And that is no small thing, because less harm could be one more hour on your life that you didn't take home my indignities and slights and spend a lot of time agonizing over whether it was worth it to try to talk to me about it or not, right? Less harm is no small thing. It leads to less stress, which leads to people living longer. I'm sure you know that the difference in lifespan has to do with stress-related diseases between white people and people of color and Black people in particular. So it has to be sustained. That's the first thing. And I mean, the bottom line, I mean, if you could get white people to actually come from that premise that, of course, they have these patterns, then they would actually be not only receptive to you helping them see them, were you on the occasion to choose to do that, but they would be grateful for it. They would understand the risk that it took, that there's a history of harm. You know, I often ask people of color, how often have you attempted to give a white person feedback on their racist assumptions or patterns and had that go well for you? You know, and they'd laugh, you know, like never, or, you know, or maybe once or twice. And so I just say, so, I mean, what would it be like if you could? What would it be like if you could just say what you're thinking and feeling and had us receive it with grace and reflect and seek to change? And I'll never forget asking that question to a group of people and a man of color raising his hand and saying it would be revolutionary. You know, a revolution that we would receive that with grace and try to change. Like, that's how difficult we are. But it's also how easy this is, right? I mean, is that a tall order? No, but it is a tall order from the current paradigm. So in what do? We have to internalize a different paradigm, and that takes on a sustained education, you know, reflection. I think that the reason the term white fragility has been useful is it kind of preempts some of that behavior, so that when it starts to come up, you have some language to push back on it. And you have to get racism on the table, right? And you have to be able to keep it on the table, and white fragility keeps it from the table. Ibram Kendi, I'm not sure he's an Africana Studies scholar, won the National Book Award for his amazing book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. He's a Black scholar. He basically says a racist policy is any policy with a racially unequal outcome. Well, that would basically make all policies in education racist policies. That if you truly believe all people are equal, the only explanation for racial inequality is racial discrimination. So get all your policies on the table and try to challenge how are these policies reproducing racial inequality, and then therefore how can we change them? Maybe this is the top of my head.
That's really good. And just because as I'm thinking about, you know, the work you do, and I know you've been doing consulting, stuff like that. So because I have a lot of friends that are in I'm in academia, and also have a lot of friends that are in the corporate world, and, you know, and they're Black like me. And a lot of times we have tons of conversations about the microaggressions or the things they experience while, on the job. I think looking at one of your talks, I think it was a C-SPAN one, you kind of gave the example of, I think it was a friend of yours or associate of yours that was moving to a particular community and felt that it was dangerous and they needed guns, but largely because people of color were living there. And that's actually pretty a common conversation that I have with my friends and colleagues that are in the corporate world and people living in certain neighborhoods and saying, oh, I couldn't live here because it's too quote unquote urban, or because it's particular crime rates or the school system, et cetera, all these kind of racially coded language. And they know what it is when they hear it immediately, but they don't address it. And then they kind of bring it home with them and then have these conversations. And even how you said doing less harm, like having an hour less of having to dwell on these things. I think it's just important, right? Of just understanding or creating a space where you can have these conversations with grace or without any other issues, and things along those lines. So do you have experience? Like, I guess you probably do, but just curious, even for our listeners of speaking at, I don't know, corporate workshops and stuff like that, and having these conversations with people who might not be as progressive maybe, or in these kind of settings where they're more likely to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah. Well, I have several thoughts of that. Well, first one, I just want to say I've never seen whiteness so fiercely protected as it is in academia. And in either form, corporate America or academia. I actually think if you cannot grapple with these issues with any kind of nuance, you're not qualified to do anything. You're not qualified to lead. You're not qualified to teach. You're actually not qualified to sit at the reception desk and greet people, right? And I just wish from the top that sentiment was taken up so that anyone who interviewed for any position anywhere had to be able to demonstrate that they had some capacity to engage with some kind of complexity in these issues. That would be really make a huge impact. Most professors cannot, right? So it either is left off, or it's left to the end and then never gotten to, or it goes into silence, or you're there, and then there's corporate America, and I have to say, there may be a check the box kind of interest, or we don't want to get sued kind of interest, but I don't think there's a sincere investment. And so part of the ways that you kind of change that is you help white people see the humanity by bearing witness. I mean, more and more I'm thinking about being raised as white as being raised to never have to bear witness to the pain of racism on people of color, and never being held accountable for the pain I've caused people of color. And so I have no capacity. And one of the things I'm noticing when I work with these, say, large tech companies, they're corporate, they're overwhelmingly under 30. And most of those young white people cannot answer the question, what does it mean to be white? What are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? They can't answer that question. And that's not benign, right? Because they bring that to the table with them, and their few coworkers of color, and again, Black people in particular, that are working with them, understand that most white people can't answer that question, that we have no insight or awareness or criticality on how our race shapes our own experiences. And if I can't tell you how my race shapes my life, I'm not going to be able to hold how your race shapes your life, right? I'm going to have no ability to hold an alternative experience to mine because I don't even know what mine is, right? So if I can't tell you what it means to be white, I can't hold what it means not to be white. And so people working in overwhelmingly white environments have to tread so lightly as not to unsettle white people who can't engage. And that was the thing that really struck me, is when these people of color shared their pain in these rooms with their white coworkers, their white coworkers were dumbfounded. Like they had no idea that their coworkers of color were in that much pain. They were oblivious to it. I mean, and again, I want to make the point that that's not benign, but that when they actually bore witness to it, it was very transforming to them. But that's because there was a container, if you will, there was a space created where those people of color felt that they could share that, and that the facilitators would kind of have their back. And then we could also facilitate the white people into receiving that in constructive ways. So I think it has to be very intentional and strategic, but space can be created. It's likely, however, not going to just happen.
Thank you for your thoroughness and thoughtfulness in all of the responses. I've gotten a lot from this interview, and I really hope our listeners do too. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to address? Anything you'd like to add that maybe didn't come up earlier?
Well, thank you for that question. Would you say the majority of your listeners are white, or do you know?
Not, they're probably Black.
Okay.
More than likely they're Black.
Although I will say that, at home, so I live in the Midwest, I have come across a lot of my husband's friends who are not Black, who do listen and share. So, they do it because they know me, but hopefully it's kind of spreading it to some other people too.
Yeah. Well, I had a thought. I realized something that you'd asked kind of how white people can take this on. One of the ways I try to do it, right? So you're they're having a conversation. White people are going into that kind of danger narrative. I wrote a piece called "Stop Telling That Story." Danger discourse and the white racial frame, like how white people kind of reinforce white supremacy through these stories. So there's a couple strategies I use, and I try to point the finger inward, not outward. So the first thing I will do is try to identify with the person in order to bring the defensiveness down. So I might say, I had that same fear before I don't know, moved or got to know or visited, right? So okay, I can identify. And I've had the opportunity to, and whatever it is, learn about this, talk to people of color, spend some time, see it from their perspective. And it's really changed how I think about what that means. And then I just kind of share what I've come to understand. You can't really argue with my insights, I'm not telling you what you should know or do. I'm telling you, this is how I now see it. And it may or may not shift that other person, but they did have to hear a counter narrative, and that's important. And I broke with white solidarity, and that's really healthy for me. So I do it for me, not the other person. And that actually kind of helps the delivery be more effective. I guess my two closing thoughts for white audiences is that niceness is not anti-racist. It's better than meanness. I'm not saying don't be nice, but being nice is not being racist. That's a double negative. But smiling, friendliness will not change racial inequality. So you have to go much deeper than just whether or not you're friendly to people of color. And there's so much good information out there today. When white people ask me, what do I do? I offer them a challenging question back. How have you managed not to know? It's 2018. Why is that your question? I mean, one of the most simplest ways to break with the apathy of whiteness is go look it up, like you would look up anything you cared about, right? There's so much good information. What I want to say to the people of color listening, honestly, on behalf of my people, I apologize for our nonsense. And I want you to know that it's not you. It is us. There is gaslighting going on. And I am going to do my best, as flawed as I am, as a part of the same system I'm trying to challenge. But I am going to keep breaking with white solidarity and try to get my people to knock off the nonsense so you don't have to go home and agonize about how to navigate our nonsense.
Well, we thank you for that.
We appreciate that. It definitely means something for sure. And, overall, this whole conversation, we appreciate you taking the time to come talk with us. Is there, for you to plug anything as far as social media, websites and stuff like that, where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more about this? Where would you like to send them?
Well, thank you. I'm not much on social media, but my website, DiAngelo, one word, .com has many videos of me giving talks, all my publications, and a whole tab of resources for people that can kind of launch them into then other venues of resources. And of course, my book.
Oh, actually, for
yes,
sure.
We will link that, and we'll link your website and other resources. Definitely.
Thanks so much.
Well, no, thank you. Thank you. We appreciate this conversation on White Fragility, Dr. DiAngelo, and we'll definitely make sure our listeners, I know they'll learn something. We'll make sure we post these resources so that they can continue to follow your work and be engaged in this conversation, but also hopefully contribute to making a change with this as well, not just leaving it at a conversation. So we appreciate all that you do.
Well, you're so welcome. Thanks for what you do too.
Thank you.
Yo, Dad, so what you think about Dr. DiAngelo stopping by and talking to us about white fragility?
I'm really happy to have had this conversation, with her. So she kind of mentioned how, it's a double-edged sword, that she is a white woman who has these conversations. So in one way, it's centering whiteness, but on the other end, it is so important to have white people who are willing to speak truth to power, as some people would say. So just really, and that she's even willing to like be like self-reflective. And you know how she talked about her story, you know, the progressive, you know, white persona, and how difficult it is sometimes for even progressive white people to like see past their progressiveness and like see some of their problematic probably ideologies and behaviors. So it was good.
Yeah, it's funny because in one of her talks that I looked at in preparing for this interview, she talked about how, and she may talk about in her book too towards the end, but how she you know, she understands she's a white progressive and, you know, has been, feel like she's an ally. And in doing that, I think there was a situation where she was at a meeting and, you know, there was a black woman with dreads, and then, you know, somebody said something and then she like mentioned something about her hair, you know, as in joking, trying to show the black woman like, yeah, I get, you know, what they're missing. Like I see from your eyes or whatever. And just had a little joke about her hair, but that really offended the black woman, which she found out later on. And then she wound up, you know, talking to the black woman and addressing the issue. And she told and the black woman asked her, like, you know, when they came to agreement, and she was just like, hey, would you rather me, you know, next time this happens, like pretty much the black woman told her, like, when this happens again, you know, not if it happens again, which she laughed at because she knows, like, yo, you're probably going to do it again. She's like, would you like me to address it publicly or privately, you know? And Dr. DiAngelo said, you know, she took the response that most people would say, instead of saying privately, she said no, publicly, you know, because I would accept it, you know, humbly and understand, accept the, you know, the feedback or whatever, but it's also so other people would see too, you know, who may not understand what they're doing is wrong, or other white folks that are in the room or in that space, you know, which I thought was very interesting, that she's still, even to this day, doing this for, you know, over a couple of decades, still finds herself, you know, having to challenge this and readdress these issues of notions of race and racism just in the daily lives that can still be problematic.
She actually said she had a quotable. We probably gonna have to put this on the website, create a meme out of it. She said, "Niceness is not anti-racism."
Oh my goodness, that is.
It's. Baby, you can be as nice as you want. You can do the smile. Actually, you know how people always, well, I don't know, on message boards, they always talk about whether the North is more racist than the South or the South is more racist than the North. And, you know, people always talk about, or some people are like, you know, I like the South, you know, because people, you know, might be blatant with it, or I prefer the North because, you know, at least people are friendly. But it's just kind of like, you know, friendliness does not equal or equate to being anti-racist. That's a good start. You know, we want to be nice and respectful to people, but that doesn't mean we don't also have to interrogate what's going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. I mean, that is a quotable. We got to make something out of that, because it's right, man. A lot of times people just, even when we see the blowback from these responses and the examples we gave when people calling the police on you know, black folk, and then how when they get caught up in it, you know, their response is like, oh, you know, I'm really nice and such a good person, or they start crying and all this other kind of stuff, to really play on that sentiment of like, yo, I'm not a racist, you know, I'm not mean and evil and doing this with malintent, but you are, you know, just and you're just mad because you got caught, really, more than anything. But yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. You know, I appreciate, I'm happy, you know, the work that she's doing, and people like herself, and even she cites the work of people like Tim Wise, and of course all other Black authors as well. I wrote down the name stamped from the beginning of that author, and check out his work. But you know, like her and Tim Wise and things like that. Like she said in the beginning of the interview, like, this is nothing new really for communities of color. One, as far as the work they're doing. And it's been said since, you know, the beginning of time. And it's the importance of their work is that, you know, they probably get a little bit more access to these white spaces to give them that shock factor, or they're maybe a little bit more willing to listen, you know, to these white folks. But I like how the recognition of like, listen, this is not my work. I didn't originate this. This is nothing that I've said or developed. I'm just, you know, speaking or amplifying the voices of the people who you may not have welcome into this space, which I think is very important.
I did too. Like she said, we ain't new to this, but I'm gonna be true to this. And there's a lot of people. And that is, I looked at her like the reference list, and I was like, wow, she got some good folk up on this list, you know, in terms of like who she's citing, you know, the work she's engaging with. And like you said, I really appreciated that she said this. Yeah. I'm not creating this, but it's a voice that's needed given how when Black authors or theorists or anti-racist workers say this, there's this natural belief that they have an axe to grind because of who they are. And it just go like, we can't do the work alone. We need allies, because sometimes it is those people who can open the doorway to, having people to say, okay, yeah, I want to look into this a little bit more deeply. So.
Mm-hmm. And now, to our white listeners, right? Even our Black listeners, but to our white listeners who are always confused and maybe looking for a resource of trying to understand whiteness and what it is and how it affects, people of color, you can now go to, or just either port people to this interview, or pick up the book, White Fragility, or look at other folks who are doing this work. But at least you have a starting point of somewhere where you can be like, hey, check out this person's work, and maybe it'll give you a better understanding of how to address this or what's going on when we talk about things like whiteness. Because it's very true. I think a lot of not just kids, but white people, when you say, what does it mean to be white? It's probably very, very hard for them to answer that question.
And that's why whiteness studies is important. Because, that's what I was trying to articulate in the beginning. And then in the middle of the interview, she kind of got into, how whiteness is seen as, the norm. It is, something that we never interrogate. And that's exactly why whiteness studies is important, to show that whiteness is not the backdrop for which we should judge everyone else. It is its own entity, and it is something that we need to delve deep into in order to overcome some of the problematic issues related to whiteness as a whole.
And, finally, her points on just suggestions of recommendations of what to do. And I think it is important that in leadership positions, or hopefully eventually lead to all positions, but understanding, especially in this country, the idea of race and racism and racist identities, racial identities, I think should be a requirement for all jobs, moving forward. People should know this, especially if you're going to be working with people or creating things. I think that has to be a major requirement.
Well, thanks to Dr. DiAngelo. Continue the work. We're definitely going to list the resources, her resources, and any other resources related to whiteness. So there's Peggy McIntosh and the Invisible Knapsack. And so there are a lot of things that I think we can link to this article to, people in the comfort of your own home can kind of get familiarized with these things and maybe push past the issues that they have.
For sure. But as always, we appreciate Dr. DiAngelo taking the time out of her busy schedule to come chat with us. If you want to, continue these conversations, of course, you can follow us on social media at BHD Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Visit our website, www.blackandhighlydangerous.com, to keep up with our most latest content. You can always email us at bhdpodcast@gmail.com with ideas of topics or guests, or if you even want to be a guest on this podcast, definitely feel free to email us with that information. And as always, continue to share us with your friends, share us with your family, share us with your enemies, and continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.